China is calling for a new vision of cooperative security for Asia and beyond, one based on mutual respect and multilateral engagement. Hello, I'm Karina Mitchell in for Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. Well, at the Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore, Beijing has pushed back against hegemonism and foreign interference in Asia-Pacific affairs. But can dialogue help close the widening gap between competing strategic visions? French President Emmanuel Macron weighed in, urging unity amid rising global tensions.
I do believe that the main risk today is a risk of division of the world and a division between the two superpowers. And the instruction given to all the others, you have to choose your side. If we do so, we will kill the global order, and we will destroy, methodically, all the institutions we created after the Second World War in order to preserve peace and to have cooperation on health, on climate, on human rights, and so on. But we need them, probably much more than before.
Well, there's a lot to get to, so let's bring in our panelists. Here in Washington, D.C., we're joined by Sourabh Gupta. He's a senior Asia-Pacific International Relations Policy Specialist at the Institute for China-America Studies. Also joining us, Anton Fedyashin is a history professor at American University. And Richard Heydarian is a senior lecturer at the University of the Philippines. He joins us from Manila. And from Beijing, Einar Tangen is senior fellow at the Taihe Institute and chairman of Asian Narratives. Welcome to all of you. Thank you all so much, gentlemen, for coming on the show. Let's get right to it. Anton, first question for you. French President Emmanuel Macron just delivered the keynote speech at this dialogue. How significant was that? Because in it, he also called for a building of a new special relationship in the Indo-Pacific.
Well, the French, of course, consider themselves an Indo-Pacific power, which is exactly what Emmanuel Macron stated at the beginning of his talk. And the proof for that he gave are the permanent military bases that France has all over the region, which already tells you general mindset with which the Europeans approach the Indo-Pacific region. He did speak a lot about cooperation and inclusivity, and in the little bit that we just heard before we came on, he spoke about not dividing the world into camps, which unfortunately, of course, is exactly what NATO has done in Eastern Europe and what its officials have already publicly on multiple occasions suggested that they will do in the Indo-Pacific region as NATO plans on creating some kind of presence that no one's defined, but it can't be good if we are to judge by its record in Eastern Europe. So Emmanuel Macron has a very long history of saying rational things, speaking a lot and prodigiously, and then the actions that his country and its allies take often run against what he actually articulates. So what he said at the Shangri-La Dialogue is good. It is partially true, but we will have to wait and see what the actions that the Western countries will take in the Pacific will be.
And one of the things he did articulate during his speech was that he warned of potential sanctions against Tel Aviv in the wake of the humanitarian crisis there. How will that stir things up, do you think, with the U.S.?
I don't think it'll stir anything up, because if the French and the Europeans had wanted to impose sanctions on Israel, they would have done it already. Talking about it doesn't change anything. When we see those sanctions, then we can discuss what their effects may be, but I don't see any reason for the Israelis to worry about that for now, because the European Union in general and most European countries have been remarkably supportive of Israel and remarkably soft in their reaction to whatever transgressions people think Israel has committed.
Now, Einar, let me come to you now. You know, China sent a delegation to Shangri-La. I want to take a listen to what the Ministry of Defense said ahead of the forum and what China's goals are at the dialogue, and get your reaction on the other side of that.
China has always actively participated in various constructive dialogue platforms, explained China's ideas and initiatives, communicated with all parties, increased trust and resolved doubts, strengthened cooperation, and jointly contributed wisdom to promoting the building of a community with a shared future for mankind.
So, Einar, how does then, China view the Shangri-La Dialogue, especially vis-a-vis the sort of rhetoric about the Indo-Pacific region?
Well, Corina, I mean, it's a necessary part of gathering defense officials together so that they, in the past, they had quieter meetings. This was an opportunity to sit side by side, get to know each other, take measure of each other, and then discuss things that were extremely sensitive from the military side. I don't mean secrets, but I just mean intentions, trying to figure out who was on the opposite side, or even better yet, trying to figure out how they shouldn't be on the opposite side, how you can be both together. Now it has become the kind of a premier event, showcases. There's a lot of political intent involved. China did not send its defense secretary. It sent a consortium of people from the Defense University and others to represent China, and that was definitely in reaction to what the U.S. has done in terms of attacking students, Chinese students who are going to the U.S., and also this absolute trade embargo that Donald Trump has asked in terms of technology. So right now, China is trying to figure out how we can have an adult conversation with Donald Trump's administration, given that he's backed down once in terms of these trade tariffs and when they would be implemented, but he seems to be constantly pushing, trying to get, some sort of reaction from China. And I think Beijing is saying, look, we have to be the adults here. We need to do this not only for China, but also for the rest of the world.
You know, last year we had Lloyd Austin. We had that famous shot of him and the China defense minister shaking hands. This year, obviously, these sideline meetings aren't happening at all. So how do you characterize the relationship between the two nations at this point when it comes to militarily?
Well, I mean, they're trying to maintain some sort of semblance of communication. It's very difficult given the kind of, as I was alluding to earlier, the political and economic situation. Donald Trump on a daily basis is taking a whack at China, trying to blame it, and then, 5 minutes later talking about how he's great friends with the leaders of China and then how it all can work out. Everyone has to remember he was saying, oh, yes, Xi Jinping is going to call me. It's very difficult to assess exactly what Donald Trump is going to do next. With the economic issues not working out the way he wants in terms of tariffs, both internally, in terms of the courts saying, no, we're this slow down, we don't think you have this power, but externally, the impact of paying tariffs, which are taxes on the American people. So this is all kind of snowballing, and the concern here is that the U.S. has the military card, that no one wants them to play that in desperation. And so these talks are absolutely necessary, but there's just not good relations right now because every time there's a step forward, there seems to be 3 steps back.
Well, someone who will be at the dialogue is, of course, U.S. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth. Saurabh, what sort of tone and messaging do you expect him to put forward on U.S. strategy?
I think Pete Hegseth's address will be a very important one. I say that because the Trump administration put out interim guidance, national and defense security guidance in March. They're racing to put out a national defense strategy, this administration, by the end of August, which would be on a very short timeline. It will be an authoritative statement of what U.S. strategy, defense strategy with regard to the Indo-Pacific will be. We have to remember that when Donald Trump came in 2017, in his first term, he brought about a major innovation in geopolitical strategy by making the Indo-Pacific region more important than the European theater in his national security strategy. And in that national security strategy, he also mentioned that we are in a new era of great power competition, which the Biden administration did not retract then thereafter. So that is essentially what US strategy was, and even went so far as to call China a revisionist power in that strategy. The thinking is on the basis of the interim guidance that we might see some other greater innovations again in that national defense strategy, and with regard to really pivoting US forces to the Indo-Pacific, creating what is called a single war planning construct. So these are very significant moves. I mean, from the Second World War onwards, the US in some way, shape, or form has had a two-war construct that it'd be able to fight in two different geographic theaters. It's now coming all into the Indo-Pacific, and the address at Shangri-La by Mr. Hegseth might give an inkling as to whether this is really going to be what will come out in the national security defense strategy. So I think what Mr. Hegseth says will be a very important indicator of US defense planning, and also I know he is going to try to reassure allies and partners in the region, considering what Mr. Trump is doing on the economic side. So it's an important, a very important address, I think.
Yeah, I think a lot of people will be listening very closely to what he has to say. I want to bring Richard into the conversation here. Before arriving in Singapore, Hegseth said he wants to, quote, achieve peace and deterrence through strength and rebalance the burden, suggesting that other countries need to do their part when it comes to defense spending. What is your reaction to that? And perhaps more importantly, how will countries attending the dialogue react to that?
Well, I mean, first of all, we know that when it comes to the Republican Party, there are really three major factions on foreign policy. You have the usual traditional primicists, the new conservatives, who have been increasingly marginalized, especially with the departure of Waltz, the former national security advisor. So basically now it's down to two important groups, the so-called prioritizers, who are saying, hey, forget about being the policeman of the world. Let's focus on the primary theater, which is Asia, and the primary challenge or rivalry, which is with China, and then the so-called restrainers, which is represented by J.D. Vance, and some would say some figures also like Hegseth. Some would say the idea is that you have to avoid confrontation with anyone as much as possible, because America has so many problems domestically. Its manufacturers is in so much mess that we have to first fix our own house before we talk about conflict. So I think in Hegseth's speech, we'll have an inkling in terms of the balance of power between the so-called restrainers and the so-called prioritizers. I think that's one thing that people who are familiar with the granular internal debates within the second Trump administration are going to look at. I think it's also important to see the reaction from other countries, including U.S. Treaty allies. For instance, President Marcos Jr. was the keynote speaker last year, and he emphasized also the concept of strategic agency. This year, Macron represents another U.S. treaty ally, and he emphasizes the idea of strategic autonomy. And my understanding of that, based on my own conversation with folks in the foreign ministry in Paris the other week, is that our idea is, yes, we're a U.S. treaty ally, but we don't want to be dictated upon, especially by this version of America. But it will be a very difficult balancing act also for key treaty allies or frontline allies, whether it's Philippines, whether it's Japan, or also the Europeans, who are also on another front line. So that's why Macron was talking about kind of a middle power diplomacy between Europe and Asia. But the reality is that as far as ASEAN and the broader Asian region is concerned, it's really 50 shades of hedging. Each country is developing a different way of surviving or thriving amid the U.S.-China rivalry.
Yeah, I think you're right. Macron was definitely, sort of offering a middle-of-the-road option for countries, saying, look, we are the reliable partner here in the midst of all the fracas that's going on, between the other world powers. Anton, let me ask you, how has America's Asia strategy changed under Trump? If you remember, former Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin said he, quote, understood the limitations of American power. Is that the case today?
It depends on what kind of American power we're talking about. If we're talking about military power, Trump comes off to me as much less likely to actually provoke a military conflict and go to war. Bearing in mind, of course, the points that both Sourabh and Richard made about the internal administration debate between the hawks and the restrainers. Trump himself seems to want to stay out of endless and pointless conflicts. But if we're talking about economic strategy, which seems to be the priority for the Trump administration here, he seems to be much more on the hawkish side of things, and this is, he makes no secret about it. We're seeing what's going on across the world with these sanctions that Trump intends to use as a tool to force countries to make agreements with the United States that are beneficial to the United States. But on the other hand, this has turned into a form of economic warfare against everyone at the same time, and this certainly doesn't lead to any kind of stability. The problem with instrumentalizing economic and financial tools as weapons is that you can keep countries guessing for a short period of time, and maybe you can extract short-term economic benefits from this, from the U.S.'s perspective. But the longer you force the world to keep guessing about supply chains and trade agreements, the more likely it is that members of the global community will start guessing their way out of the Western established economic and financial system, and they will start looking for alternatives such as the BRICS. And that's exactly what we've been witnessing going on for 10, 15 years now, which is why the world's fastest growing forum these days is actually the BRICS Plus, with Indonesia just joining in January of this year.
Yeah. Einar, let me ask you, you know, both China and the U.S. seem to be trying to find this new equilibrium with this new Trump administration that's come in. And there's this sort of sense of a growing struggle for dominance in the Indo-Pacific region. That extends to a lot of the countries that are participating. How big a concern do you think it is for these countries at this dialogue?
Well, these countries don't want to be, they don't want to be the grass when the elephants fight. That is very clear. But, Karina, I'd rephrase your question. I mean, the issue here is that the United States is the one who is provoking it. It's their warships that are going up and down the Taiwan Straits. It is their economic attacks and war on Beijing that is, in decreasing the amount of trust that is out there. And it's, these AUKUS and the Quad, these kind of World War I era alliances, which are definitely aimed at China. So China is responding to these, and basically everyone around is saying, look, we sympathize. We're also under attack by the U.S., especially economically, and we're under tremendous pressure from the State Department and anything that has to do with China. But we don't want to put our people in between these two great powers. So that is their purpose. It doesn't mean they don't support China. I mean, quite frankly, China doesn't ask people to take sides. What they do is, if you recognize one China principle, they will trade with you, and that is the basis. They're not pushing an ideology. It's the U.S. who believes that it has the answer in a box, and that everybody should fit in that box, which I believe is the problem that we're having.
Sourabh, Macron weighed in on this issue. So take a listen to what he had to say, and I'll get your reaction on the other side of that.
France is a friend and an ally of the United States, and is a friend, and we do cooperate, even if sometimes we disagree and compete with China. I do intend to remain so, loyally.
So what is your take on how this is affecting the region, and how much is there pressure on countries in the Indo-Pacific, the Asia-Pacific region, to pick sides?
That pressure has existed for quite some time now. But the Asia-Pacific countries also, as I think Richard mentioned, they have agency, they have strategic agency. This is the geography of peace and deterrence in the Asia-Pacific is very different from the way it is in Europe, where there's geographic contiguity and you have the NATO and it's an alliance system. In the Asia-Pacific, it's individual alliances and partnerships that the US has. This gives these countries agency in terms of how far they can go and with regard to their relations with the US and China. Frankly, at this point of time, what they want to hear from Mr. Hegseth is that the US will be a stable and dependable ally, frankly, because Mr. Trump has shown that he can do anything against allies and partners also. So at this point of time, they want the US, at least from the defense and strategic side, to be more in than out, and thereafter restrain the US not to push the envelope too much with regard to China on the security side, so that there is a rough and ready equilibrium. I think they're playing this game well, and they're comfortable with it. What I would say is the challenge for, first let me get to the Europeans. The challenge for the Europeans is that the Trump administration is telling them, hey, don't come to Asia. You deal with your security and your security threat, Russia. We will fill capability gaps that you all have out there, but you don't come and waste your time in Asia with all your deployments. So the Europeans have to think which way, how is their next Indo-Pacific policy going to be? And with regard to its Indo-Pacific partners, it's obviously going to ask them to kind of ramp up their own defense budgets, that the US does not have to take such a huge lead in that regard. And countries will say, you know, we will have more defense budgets, but then we also want greater autonomy in decision-making within US-Asia partnerships, so that we can kind of frame the dimensions of that partnership. So it'll be interesting to watch how the sides move forward from here.
Richard, I want to ask you, how reliable do you think Indo-Pacific nations think the US is?
Well, I think it's correctly pointed out by earlier that you have to have an intersectional understanding here, that when it comes to the military front, it looks like there is some continuity rather than the departure that many people were fearing. Whether you're in the Philippines or Japan, there's an understanding that Trump 2.0 will basically build on the kind of Biden integrated deterrence strategy, and we saw the skeletal version of that in the first Trump administration. But absolutely on the economic front, this is really the big question mark. I think what we're seeing right now is that a lot of Asian countries are, wondering, like, the U.S. cannot demand us to be ramping up our defense spending while indirectly or directly torpedoing our economy, right? I mean, if the United States pushes for extractive new trade agreements with Japan and Korea and the Philippines or Taiwan, among others, it could undermine their economic growth, and that could also undermine their ability to support their defense spending. So I think what's going to happen in the coming days and months, if not years, is that regional partners of the United States will leverage their geopolitical importance to say, hey, I'm going to be helpful to you. Don't put like 20% tariff on me or 15 or 16% tariff on me. And maybe, yes, you're not going to give me free trade agreements, but maybe we can have sectoral cooperation or sectoral free trade agreements. So there are going to be a lot of negotiations behind the scenes. And then at the same time, you have non-aligned countries like Malaysia, for instance. So I'm looking forward also to the presentation by Prime Minister Anwar, who's the chairman of the ASEAN this year, because Anwar's understanding of hedging or strategic agency may be quite different from Macron. I think Macron was onto something when he said non-alignment is no longer an option. So I think his idea is that you cannot be completely non-aligned, meaning more passive, or say, I treat both US and China equally, but it's saying you have to be proactive. So that means more work among middle powers. I'm not sure that version of hedging is something that countries like Malaysia or more and more, key countries in the ASEAN subscribe to. To be honest, based on my own, attendance in ASEAN summits and events this year, it looks like many in ASEAN countries see China as a responsible superpower, and they see the Trump administration as a disruptive power, particularly because of the trade wars that Trump has been launching.
Einar, I want to ask you very quickly, from the Chinese perspective, what needs to be done to help thaw these relations between the U.S. and China?
Well, you have to stop with this kind of incessant daily warfare, especially announcing that no chips, going after Chinese students. I mean, how can you have negotiations when somebody is continually stabbing you in the back? It's really important. We've seen what happens if you show any sign of weakness or you go to see Trump, Ramaphosa, Prime Minister Trudeau, and also we can't forget what happened to Zelensky. So in those kind of situations, no one dares to go and sit with Donald Trump anymore. So the question is, how do you have a meaningful dialogue? It's got to start with respect. You cannot do that. I don't know how you're going to get anything done. And unfortunately, there's not a lot of that going around. Pete Hegseth has his own problems. It's a question of how long he'll be there, given the many mistakes that he has made. And then with Donald Trump, very hard to know where exactly he's going to go. But we do know anytime something fails, he's going to make some sort of blockbuster announcement that keeps people's attention turned away from the real issue, which is he's not making much progress.
Anton, how much closer do you think we are to the emergence of a multipolar world? One where China has said, these three pillars, strength in development and security, and a peaceful sort of civilization where everyone sort of gets along with another. We've seen these initiatives growing in the global south. We've seen the BRICS. What's your opinion?
I think that we're there already. It's no longer a question of how close we are. It's a question of the rate at which multipolarity will establish itself. And BRICS is the organization, or rather the forum, to watch, and we'll see what happens in Brazil, which is hosting this year's summit.
So, Anton, in that vein, does a more multipolar order lead to a more stable order, in your opinion?
Not necessarily. The question is whether the players are committed to diplomacy. For example, the Cold War was a bipolar order that we take for granted was more stable than a multilateral one, but if you happen to live in Vietnam, Korea, Afghanistan, or Angola, it certainly wasn't terribly stable. So the commitment to diplomacy is the key to answer that question.
Mr. Rob, could it lead to greater multilateralism?
Yes, I think it can lead to greater multilateralism in the economic dimension, but in the security dimension, my fear is that as a multipolar order emerges, that we will see a tightening and a sharpening of alliance systems, and we're already seeing a networking of alliance systems in the Indo-Pacific, and that could lead to disruption and arms racing and greater tensions. So we'll have to see.
All right, gentlemen, thank you so much for your time and perspective. It was a fascinating discussion. I'm Karina Mitchell in Washington, D.C. Thanks so much for being with us.